Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here for an FAQ on vacuum sealing. So even though some of these questions I've answered in separate shorter videos, I figured I'd do a compilation, putting the most common ones together so I can have it all in one video. And first one is, when it comes to vacuum sealing into jars, the most common question I get is, do I use oxygen absorbers or desiccants? And no, I do not. I never use them, and I've never used them in my vacuum sealed jars. My personal opinion is they're a waste of money and they're totally pointless as long as you're getting a good seal on your items and your items are fully dry. I also do not use desiccants. I've never used those at all. But here's the deal. You have to do what you think is best for you. If you like taking that little extra step just to ensure everything's going to be great, then sure, you can add desiccants and or oxygen absorbers if that makes you feel better. Some people do that just in case they lose a seal on the jar, and then what would happen is the oxygen absorber can possibly, not always, activate and reseal that jar to prevent any rancidity. That's usually the only problem you're going to have, and that is only those things that have fat in them. You're not going to have your herbs and vegetables go rancid because they didn't stay vacuum sealed. They're going to have their own different issues, and I'll cover a few of those. So some things like mushrooms, for instance, I like to keep them vacuum sealed because it will keep them crisp. Otherwise, mushrooms are one of those things, just because their final product is a lot like any kind of freeze-dried product. And that means they're very light and crisp, but also like a sponge, and they will quickly soak moisture up from the air and then can get stale. They can still taste good and be fine, especially if you're going to cook with them anyway, but I prefer to try to keep them crisp, especially if I think I want to break them up into smaller pieces. That makes it easy. If they're not crisp, you can't do that. Or if I decide to powder the items. For fruits such as apples, I like to vacuum seal them. They'll stay fine in a non-vacuum sealed jar, but it's going to help preserve the quality of those for a lot longer period of time. And then with herbs, same thing. Any herbs that I'm working through, such as these camellia flowers right here, these are not vacuum sealed because I'm using these, I'm working through them, and they're going to be just fine. Most of your herbs will last for many years without any kind of vacuum seal. Just have a canning jar and just put it on there snugly, tight enough, not so tight you can't get it back off, but so that it's, it's airtight for the most part. And then I've got here, I have some honeysuckle flowers that also go in my homemade skin cream, like the camellia flowers. But then the black olives and the cabbage, red or green, I like to keep those vacuum sealed. That means, like with this jar here, even though I've opened it and used some of it, I did reseal it. I will not do that with everything. I don't do that with my egg powder. Even though there's fat in it, I have had no issues with that. But for the long-term storage, I do vacuum seal it. Now carrots, no problem. This is not vacuum sealed. This is a jar I'm currently working through, obviously, and I don't vacuum seal it between each use. So certain things I've just learned it's best to vacuum seal between each use if you've got it, especially if you've got a bigger jar. And some things it's not important. You can just open them up and work through them, even if it takes you a year or so, and they're fine. But nuts of any kind, unless you know you're going to work through the jar within a few months, I do recommend vacuum sealing them if you're putting them into long-term storage. So just like these almonds. Yes, I know there's this rumor going around, you should never vacuum seal nuts because of botulism. And it's not because they'll go rancid, it's actually the opposite. Vacuum sealing your nuts prevents them from going rancid. That's why I always vacuum seal. So I have an example right here. A few years ago, I bought some walnuts from Costco and vacuum sealed them using the chamber. So this is where the chamber comes into play, is when I'm recycling jars like this. And I vacuum sealed them into several green olive jars. Well, I went to pull out this jar, and when I opened it up, I realized that didn't pop like it should have. It opened too easily, which means I didn't test the top, and I realized either I didn't seal it properly and didn't check it, or it came unsealed shortly after I put it into storage. I tasted the top one, it was rancid. I dug down a little bit, tasted a few more, rancid. And yes, you will know when nuts have gone rancid. They get kind of this weird, bitter, nasty, it's not just a flavor, it's a feeling that it leaves in your mouth. So these are no good, sadly. But the jar right next to it that I vacuum sealed at the same time that stayed sealed, they're perfectly good. So thankfully that jar's good. So because of incidents like this that have happened on a couple of occasions, because I actually had some Brazil nuts that went rancid, but the jar was partially used. So what happened was I opened the jar, was working through them, and they got pushed to the back of the pantry, and I forgot they were there, and they sat there for, I don't know, a couple of years maybe. And by the time I realized they were there, it was too late. They were rancid, unfortunately. So because nuts are expensive, this is a real shame, but it's a lesson. And it's these kind of lessons that I learned, that anytime I vacuum seal a jar, especially something that is either going to go stale if it doesn't stay sealed, or something that will go rancid if it doesn't stay sealed, I always leave it out on the counter for a couple of days and make sure that it stays sealed, because it could just been something got embedded in the lid. It might have kind of got a fault seal. You know, usually in the first 24 hours or so, you'll find, if it's something like that, you'll find that, you know, okay, I need to reseal this one. But sometimes, especially with jars like this, what happens is if you're moving stuff around in there and they knock together, it can cause this to come unsealed, especially if it wasn't a super tight seal to begin with. And for whatever reason, either this one wasn't fully sealed when I put it back in storage because I didn't give it that time to check, or it just came unsealed because it got knocked around with something else and I didn't realize it. So anytime you're moving that kind of stuff around in your food storage, double check everything to make sure nothing came unsealed, or at least listen, because you'll know, you'll hear a tink, some kind of little pop. And but if you're making too much noise, you won't hear it. A pop like that, like this unsealed jar right here. Now, I did find a jar of mushrooms that had come unsealed, and I'm going to reseal those right now. Thankfully, I did check them, and they are still crispy, so that's good. They didn't turn stale. Now, the thing about mushrooms is they won't go rancid. They're still good. You can still use them that way. You can throw them right into soups and sauces, and they'll be just fine if they're kind of that more rubbery feel. But these are still crispy. So one of the things I will do is I will seal that. I'll show you. I'll go ahead and do that right now so I don't forget about it later. But this, my favorite method of all. I've tried several different ones, and I'll link to a video down below of options for vacuum sealing. And even since I shot that video, there's been more options out there, and a lot of them are very inexpensive. But my favorite method is the tried and true brake bleeder pump. You can get this from your local hardware store. I don't think the brand really matters. Or auto parts store. This is considered an auto part. It's used for vehicles, for bleeding brakes. But this is my favorite tool for vacuum sealing my food. So that's what this is for. This one is not to be used for bleeding brakes. And then I use the Food Saver tops. But there's all kinds of different brands out there now that you can get for cheaper. But Food Saver has actually lowered the price of their tops like this. You can get a kit for pretty inexpensive these days. So anyway, you just put your lid. I always use a recycled metal lid. These are the best. The brand doesn't really matter as long as it's a recycled lid. That way you're making the most out of that lid. But I find recycled lids tend to work a little better than brand new lids that you haven't used for canning yet. And then Tatler lids, the kind, you know, your 2-part lid, like you can see in this image here, those do not work well for vacuum sealing. You might get a seal, but it's not going to hold. I've tried so many different ways. The older style ones held the seal for longer, and some even for years, but not always. A lot of them came unsealed along the way. You just slit the top over the lid, make sure it's in there snug. This is the wide mouth, so your set's going to have a regular mouth and wide mouth. So this only is going to work for canning jars, not for jars like this. And then you take the brake bleeder pump, you insert the tip This is just one of the many ways you can do it. This is the way I do it. And then you just rest your brake bleeder pump against the counter and press down with your hands. Don't do it this way. You're going to wear your hands out a lot faster. And just use your whole arm, even all clear up to your shoulder, and you just pump it until it gets to at least straight up and down, like due north. And I usually go farther than that as well, just to make sure. Now, it's possible there was an issue with this lid, and that's why it came unsealed. But you can see right now it's sealed, no problem. So I will leave this out for the next day and make sure it holds that seal. If the seal comes undone within the day, I'm going to double check this lid. There could be some issues there. So that's how I do it. Again, if you want more information on the various ways you can vacuum seal, go check out that video. I'll be linking to in the description box down below, but I can't go over all that today. This video would be too long. A lot of people ask, can you vacuum seal in Mylar? You can. There's ways to do it. I had a food saver for years. Well, I've had several over the years, and they kept breaking down. I get a new one, break down, and get a new one. And they usually only last about 2 years. And so I finally gave up. My brake bleeder, I've had the same brake bleeder for 7 years, or over 7 years, going on 8 years now. Works great. I've used it, I don't know how many times. And to me, it worked better at vacuum sealing than my food saver ever did, ever. But you can use food savers. You can use your seal mill. I don't know what all the attachments are, but I believe you can use anything that's got a pump and you have the right kind of hoses you can hook up to it. You can use to vacuum seal. There's so many different ways that it can be done. But with Mylar, it's a little tricky because it doesn't, like the food saver bags, for example, have the ridges on them. And those ridges are needed so the air can actually get pulled out of the bag. Without the ridges, the air's not going to go through. Where Mylar does not have that. There are ways I've seen people do it, and I've tried it and kind of got it to work, where you can take the piece of a food saver bag, a little strip, put it in where you're going to seal the Mylar, and then use like a food saver or something like that, and then vacuum seal it that way. So the heat then, the last step is the heat that actually seals all that. And some people will use that. Again, I found it too fiddly and frustrating and only seemed to get one bag to seal. What I've done, and the only time I use Mylar for smaller items is if I'm putting them in our go bags. And in that case, what I do, I say I'm making my food ration bars. I've got a couple different recipes. My favorite one is the ginger. What I do is I just put it in the bag, in the Mylar bags. I'll put a clip right here so you can see from an old video. And then I get the Ziploc kind, and then I just lower it down into a big bowl of water, making sure I don't get the water inside the bag, and so the water will push the air out, and then I just zip it shut. And that works pretty good. Some people will use a straw method, and that works for some people pretty good as well. I found I had a harder time with that one. I never could get the timing right. You got to pull the straw out and zip it up before the air goes back in there, and that can be a little tricky. But yeah, you can mess around with that and find it, if that works for you. I just prefer to not have to use Mylar if I can help it. Now, another question I get is, how do you open them? So I have one of these that I got with a cheap vacuum sealing kit that I thought I'd try out. It was like 20 bucks. And I don't like it as much. I got one of these, something very similar, also from, I can't remember what company, Food Saver or something. Or no, it's from Tatler. I don't like it as much as this old tried and true. This is probably could be from the 70s. I don't know which one of us brought this into our marriage, but just your old tried and true bottle opener. It's got a nice wide surface here, which I find far better than this. And it's going to do less damage to your jars. Let's go ahead and open this again so I can vacuum seal it again. Yay. You just stick the edge under there. This works the same way with Tatler lids, and just gently open it. It works great. And sometimes you might get a tiny bend in your lid, but for the most part, you hardly get any bend. I'm not gonna vacuum seal again this right now, but I'll put that there so I don't forget. Now let's come back to the powders, vacuum sealing powders. I have a lot of powders. I have peanut butter powder. I have some different dairy powders. I have the egg powder. I've got homemade cheddar cheese powder, vacuum sealed into jars. And anytime I'm vacuum sealing powders, when I learned this through experience, it took me a while to figure out what was going on because I was trying to vacuum seal cocoa powder up, and putting some kind of barrier right over the top of the ingredients. This is just a piece of cotton cloth. You can use a chunk of paper towel. You can use, some people like those little mini muffin liners because they fit in there real nice, or coffee filters. Now, muffin liners like that and coffee filters aren't something we use. So for me, I always have scrap material that's cotton. So I just put a piece of that over the top. And then what that does is it prevents the powder from coming up under the lid as you're vacuum sealing. And when that happens, it puts a coating between the lid and the jar. So even if it seems like you got a good seal, it's not going to hold. So putting that there will prevent that from happening. And it works great doing it that way. I've had this jar of eggs, I've got 5 more back there, sealed up like this since 2022, and they're all sealed and they're all still good. And then I get questions. I mean, I just grabbed some random jars, the ones that were easiest for me to get to. But another question I've been getting a lot is, can you vacuum seal your more pliable dried fruits such as raisins, prunes, figs, and so on? Yes, and I highly recommend it. Some people will say, no, there's too much moisture. Well, no. What you have to realize is especially when they're dried like that, the sugar content is condensed in there, and the sugar is going to prevent spoilage anyway. And so I have found it to be much better to vacuum seal my raisins, my figs, anything like that I've dried that may still seem pliable, may seem to still have moisture in it, and it's going to keep them soft rather than turning into little hard rocks like they do if you don't have them vacuum sealed, or you just have them in a box in a cupboard, and they get really hard, and they're not pleasant. They're hardly any good. But vacuum sealing is going to keep them keep the quality of them so much longer. So with that question comes the probably other most asked question, and that is, it might even be the most asked question actually, and that is, how long will they last? Well, and then people want me to give exact figures. I can't give you exact figures, but I can give you an estimate. And my estimate is, if you have a good tight seal on your jars, if you're keeping them in at least a fairly cool and dark location, they should last indefinitely. What a lot of people don't think about when it comes to shelf-stable food is that it's meant to be shelf-stable. And just because you buy food in the store that has an expiration date, that doesn't mean it's bad at that point. And in fact, if you read closely on those dates, hardly any of them anymore say expiration date. They say best buy date, and people still see that as an expiration date. A lot of people don't realize until you look into it, just like myself, is that those dates are pretty much superfluous on most things. I mean, your fresh milk, yeah, of course. But when it comes to your shelf-stable food, it's pretty much all superfluous. But it's simply, at least in the United States, it's required by I think it's the FDA requires that they put an expiration date on their food, even if it doesn't expire. I mean, I've seen honey with expiration dates on it, or best buy dates, and honey doesn't go bad. It does not spoil. It is the one food that will never spoil. Will it crystallize? Will the color and flavor change over time? Sure, but it doesn't spoil. And so it's a silly thing. People have had home canned foods that have lasted for many, many years and were still good. It's all about how it's stored and if your seals hold. So I wouldn't be afraid of any of these foods as long as they stayed sealed 10, 20 years from now. And again, I would say, generally speaking, it should last indefinitely. But just like this jar of walnuts where the seal came undone, these aren't any good. Why? It wasn't because they were vacuum sealed. and put back in storage for a few years. It was because they came unsealed and then sat back there. Remember, if you're freaking out about, because you got all the people saying, oh, you can't do that, botulism, most people don't have a problem going to the grocery store and buying a jar or a can of nuts that have been vacuum sealed. And who knows how long they were sitting in the warehouse before they came to the store, and then they're sitting on the store shelf. So I hope you enjoyed this video and at least answered most of your questions. Again, if you have any more questions, put them in comments down below. And also know that I'll be linking to my full dehydrating playlist that I started clear back in 2016. And just know that through the years that I have removed some videos that are just kind of don't apply anymore. But some of them I've left up, and I do some things a little bit differently, but not all of it. And anyway, you can learn from those, get some more ideas on the types of things you can dehydrate and put up. And there's a lot more out there that you can dehydrate that you probably don't realize that you can do. Some people think you have to have certain special equipment to put up things like meat and milk and cheese and eggs. You don't. You can just use a regular dehydrator, or not even that. You can put up your meat just drying it the very old-fashioned way by using the sun or just the heat from your wood stove or whatever. So if you want to look into that information, those links, just make sure you click on more or show more, those words, somewhere down here below the video screen to open the description box all the way. And then you can look through there and see all those links and any other information I put in there. And if you have any thoughts or ideas, your favorite way to put up your dried foods, any of your experience that you have to share, please put those in comments down below as well. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.